Well, today's episode of the Embodied Love Lounge, welcome back. We are going to be talking about what we value, or like what we conceptualize as to be good sex, and how that affects our ideas as well of what makes for a good cock or a good pussy, and vice versa.
Okay, that sounds interesting. I hope. So, jump us in.
Well, I mean, let's just kind of, we could look at, I listen to a lot of hip hop. I like rap. Some of the songs, and like a lot of the songs, however, when it comes to sex, I just don't resonate with it. I'm like, okay, yeah, the beat's cool. You can definitely have sex to the beat. Like, it rhymes, so there's a nice flow to it. It might sound cool, but then when I start hearing, like, looking at like what the words that are being used, I actually don't find the acts that attractive or all that great. I mean, most of the time it's about, you know, the guy trying not to, or just busting within like 2 seconds because the woman's so great, or that she has like this tight pussy that he's going to beat up and make it so rough and good for her that she can't walk for 3 days. And just like, that also doesn't sound like a good sexual experience.
It's kind of a bad sex education.
It really is.
It's like how to have bad sex.
But I feel though that's why that there is in our culture a perception of how hot sex should look like. And I think it largely comes from a couple sources. One is probably nowadays the biggest source is porn. Mm-hmm. And so that can be like very rough, very extreme sex has a tendency to go in that direction. The other one are kind of all of the rom-com, romance, novel type of stuff, which is like extreme romanticism that frankly, either extreme romanticism or extreme passion. Those have slightly different
meanings. But even
meanings.
then, the sex scenes aren't that great.
Well, then it's actually everything that happens up before the sex scene. You see, like, there's the flirting, there's like the tearing off of the clothes, stuff starts getting thrown around, and then normally the scene has them kind of fall into bed, and then it cuts and it pops out, and then their hair's all messed up, and they're kind of like looking at each other breathless, or like holding each other nice and calm, and then they go about their day. And so then again,
or if
romanticization
it's a Hollywood movie, it's
isn't
a
about the sex.
Wonder.
Well, but yeah, even then though, it's again all the build up and stuff after that's more interesting than what they're actually doing. Mm-hmm. And when Hollywood or camera does focus on what they're doing, then it just becomes very kind of rough normally and made for the camera.
But I did like the sex scene in 300 between the king and the queen.
Well, what was it about it that you liked about that?
There was no graphic genital focus.
And you also don't have anything against graphic genitals.
It's just that when it's just that, it's never my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's not how I see what happens. And so what was going on was the two perspectives. The camera angles were changing. It was sensual. You could feel the eroticism between them. You could feel the connection between them. It was kind of the first time I saw sex in a movie that I was like, wow, this is actually like hot. And it's amazing. But it wasn't your typical, I think they were depicting it as it was like all night long, and they were really like attuned to each other and really into each other. It was very sexy without being explicit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and also, if you were to look at that scene, I believe she was the one on top of him.
They did all kinds of positions.
Okay, I don't remember the
scene
so
they
well.
flowed. They flowed from one to another.
Well, just that in and of itself, I think, is already very different than what you'll see in a lot of portrayals.
And it was how they were looking at each other. They had a lot of lust, but you could see they were also respectful. You know, it wasn't like, I'm going to make this pussy, like, beat it till it bleeds kind of thing. Because that's actually shocking to me how many of the young women that I'm now needing to coach, and they'll tell me that this is like the attitude that comes in, and like, what? So it's we're promoting really poorly skilled lovers at this point in the visuals, in the talk, in the rap, even in the romance,
which typically leads to pain, numbness, and also a short sexual experience. It's
going to lead to women who don't want to have sex with you.
Yeah.
So here you are, you know, wanting to be the stud, and you want to like also be the provider. Well, a lot of times guys want to marry their girlfriends or whatever, but the way in which they have sex, they wonder why once they get married, the sex kind of falls away. Well, she gets what she wants, which is, you know, the long-term relationship connection, but she's kind of done with being beaten up and not really like in a state of great pleasure. A lot of women fake, like a lot more than we think. I've never done that. I don't have the capacity to fake. I'm just like, time out. Yeah, like, but time out. We need to, let's just shift gears.
As in, like, go our separate ways?
Or just do something else. Like, if it's not going well in one direction, I will shift it to something else and then never go back to visit that again. But a lot of women don't want to hurt your feelings. Not you as in Aaron, but you as in the proverbial lover. And so they won't say anything. They will fake their pleasure. And that's terrible, because then you're creating this...
It trains the person to do the same thing again.
They think that they're confident. They really know what they're doing, but actually they're terrible. So, and we don't have to be terrible, but because we have really bad sex ed that's not geared towards, hey, this is how you generate pleasure in a body. And then you have porn, which is a show.
For a camera.
It's just a show. I mean... The really, really good sex, often you can't really see what's going on. It's a lot going on, but you can't see it because it's not made for the camera. And then you have, I think, just an inheritance of societal attitudes around sex, that it's dirty, that it's bad, or, you know, let's have, you know, naughty sex, but naughty sex ends up being not such nice sex. So I think we're up against a lot. We could really use some really good instruction, which is why in this episode I really want to focus not just on the myths and what's actually going on with friction sex, which is what we're kind of calling the average way of how people are interacting, and comparing it to the option of learning suction sex and specifically genital-wise, the difference between what we call a good cock and a good pussy when it comes from a friction sex perspective versus a suction sex perspective. So maybe we can also just, what is a good cock, what is a good pussy?
Well,
from the two perspectives.
I was going to say, let's kind of revisit a little bit the languaging that's typically put around the concepts or idealizations of what is a good pussy. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people probably recognize it. You know, it's like, well, first of all, it should be a small pussy.
Like physically small or internally small?
Well, frankly, they don't really... Like, it's just someone I say like a small pussy, but I feel that a person thinks that if it looks small from the outside, then therefore it should be small from the inside, and
but there's
small from the outside.
And all the surgeries that are happening right now, women are trying to reduce and make small their labias.
Yeah, it's not just the vagina.
Yeah,
it's also the
you want to look like a prepubescent child, basically.
Yes. Precisely.
Yeah.
So there's, I mean, you even see kind of in the, like some of like the swimsuit editions where they just kind of flatten everything out so that there is no poof, there is no like real outer labia. It's just very flat.
But you have to understand, a grown woman, like when you start developing your breasts and you want your breasts to come out, you're very excited, you want big boobs, right?
Your like, outer labia also attends to
right? But then the labia, inner and outer, start to grow. And that's intentional because a fully functional adult vulva is going to have some cushion for the pushing.
Yeah, it's basically erectile tissue. Not basically, it is erectile tissue.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so we want a small prepubescent looking outer.
Well,
and then we want
typical society,
a small inner.
Well, then
tight.
They jump to the next thing is tight.
Yeah.
Which I think has to do a lot with the kind of like.
But with friction
vagina.
sex, that would make sense.
Yeah,
tighter would be better in that sense.
And you know, you hear a lot of language about like, oh, pussy feels like it's got me in a headlock, or it's got the death grip, or it's choking the life out of my cock. Or...
one lady, she's like, my pronouns are gorilla grip.
Gorilla grip, yeah, exactly. And yes. The ability to have a vagina that is strong, and the ability to have a vagina that has dexterity, the ability that has a vagina that can be adaptive and versatile, these things are very important. But just to then come down and reduce it to tightness, which frankly, I mean...
And squeezing. Right? The tighter you can squeeze.
Well, we'll get to that. So the tightness, though, is important because we think about tightness being good because it can create more sensation. And because it can create more sensation because it's stronger. But I mean, like, if you were to think about going to work out, you don't want your body tight. Yes, you want to be able to be
Strong.
fit. You want to be strong, toned, but you need to have range of motion
and suppleness in the
in the muscle, or else it's just going to sit there frozen.
And plus, it becomes dysfunctional. You actually atrophy a muscle that's constantly tight and clenched will start to atrophy.
Yes,
you can see that with long-term chronic tension. In some areas, the whole system will atrophy. This is also true for the pelvic floor.
Well, I mean, if you were to go and kiss somebody, you wouldn't be like, "Oh, I love how you hold your lips so tight." Like, yeah, you got a nice tight mouth. Like, that doesn't work for kissing. You want a mouth that can like move, that sucks, that's supple. So we'll get into some of the suction sex qualities that come around a pussy. But so far we've identified small, tight, and what can a friction pussy do? If it's really, really skilled, then it can squeeze on you.
Squeeze really hard.
Squeeze really hard.
Like so hard. Yeah,
it chokes you.
Well, I had in the beginning, when I was learning all this stuff, I wanted to be like the sex goddess. And I was doing vaginal weightlifting. And I'd gotten to the point where I could squeeze so tightly that I would actually like the erection would go away for the guy because it was too much. And I was like, well, this sucks because I don't want that to go away. Like, that wasn't the plan. The plan was like to keep it going.
So you literally tapped them out. Too much sexual UFC.
Yeah, exactly. Like the second I was like, death grip.
Like, put him to sleep.
So I had to learn how to relax and soften. And I don't know, you recently called me, what is it, a judo master? So there's still strength, but there's movement. And so that's really important. But I have to say, when I was younger, this was the thing that I thought I had to, in order to be quote unquote the sex goddess, I had to be able to lift, 50-pound barbell in between my legs and then use that on some poor person that just couldn't contend with that. And it actually ruined my sex life.
Well, the other part then that I kind of want to touch on is this other image that a pussy is just a hole. And it's just a hole that's there to receive, to get fucked, to get beaten up, to be like punished, to be, like there's all of these kind of like aggressive words around fucking a pussy that kind of give you the idea that, okay, well, it is, since it's just a hole, you just stick things in and out of it and you do what you want, and the harder and the harder you pound it, like the better that it is. So a
lot of people are surprised that it's not just a hole.
Yes. Well, that's kind of the thing I think that people don't even really realize that they think.
Yeah.
But so what are the conclusions then if you have well, I'm just going to list them out what we just said, and we're going to go through.
And we'll go more explicit in the explicit side.
Well, there's a point that I want to make before we go into the explicit side. Is that okay? So small, tight, squeezing, just a hole to be beaten up. Okay. So what are the qualities that we look for a cock? Well, it should be
everything opposite.
It should be big.
Yeah.
It should be hard.
Yeah.
It should be able to bang and fuck
for a long time.
For a long time.
Well, 5 minutes.
Yeah. And as opposed to a hole, it's like a weapon. It's like a gun. It's a sword. It's something that explodes. Like, so what happens when you take something that's small and put it with something that's big, something that is tight with something that's hard, something that bangs on something that's meanwhile is squeezing while it's just being treated as a hole, and this is then a sword. That leads to rough sex.
Yeah.
Like that recipe there.
But that is the definition from friction sex perspective. From pornography.
It's kind of idealized in the mind, but then people's reality and experience of it is that sex, average man lasts 5 to 7 minutes. Average woman won't reach orgasm until 14 minutes. So we have a mismatch there in terms of being able to last long enough.
Would you say also there's an issue around circumcision? Is that part of it?
I think that most popular culture doesn't really touch on that. I do think that most westernized culture, unless you're from Europe, thinks that being circumcised is clean, whereas uncircumcised is dirty. And there's a lot of information out there on benefits one way versus the other way. But I think for the purpose of this conversation, though, just how do we idealize a cock in terms of its functionality for sex? I think the circumcision part is more of like an aesthetic thing on a cock.
Well, I bring it up because there's aesthetic pieces to the vulva.
Yeah.
But saying all of that, then if I don't have those qualities myself, like I compare myself to those qualities, now I'm going to feel insufficient. There's something wrong with me, and I've got to fix it. And so in the explicit side, I want to talk about the surgeries that women are putting themselves through just to try and fit into this mold that you just described, including men who are going through a lot of different procedures, using penis pumps, but also getting like enhancements, injections, all kinds
Well, what
of
happens if you follow this to the logical conclusion? Okay, so guys can go ahead and just give themselves these massive dicks, and women can give themselves these tiny little pussies. Eventually it's going to go to the extreme that it doesn't actually physically function with each other.
Well, I had a client, she was a tiny Asian lady from Japan, and her boyfriend was an African American and tall and big, and every single time they would have intercourse, she would bleed and be in a lot of pain, even if he was slow, even if he was gentle. It was just literally something. They were in the extreme. It's very, very rare I've seen that, but they were in the extreme where it just, at some point, they had to break up because it was unpleasant for both of them. So it's sad.
Yeah. Well,
that's extreme, but I'm just...
And at the same time, when we just had an episode on fisting, I'm imagining his cock isn't the size of a fist. And the issue I think I want to show is that, yes, we can always probably find some examples that it would be so extreme that it would take a lot more effort than normal to make it match.
Correct.
But at the same time,
yes,
a woman can give birth to a child. So there are ways to move. But my point here is that we have set ourselves up for failure, both in how we idealize what it is that we're looking for.
Yeah.
Because if we had that ideal, it wouldn't really work with a reality of it. And then how we idealize what good sex is, even if we don't really believe that's it, it's kind of how one or the two in a partnership will begin to act it out, which starts to have a lot more movement, a lot more friction, where the factors are bigger, harder, faster equals better.
And you see it a lot in Hollywood movies. I actually remember this one scene where they were having sex in a pool, and she was thrashing around, so the water is splashing, and it looks exciting because her body's really writhing and thrashing. But if you think having sex when the genitals are submerged in water, it's actually unpleasant.
Yeah.
And
if it's a swimming pool with chlorine,
and you wouldn't be leaning back the way that she is and thrashing and being able to have the sensation that she's pretending she's having. Like that just whole scene, what it does to people's minds, it's not realistic. So then you try and replicate it, and then you think you're a failure. And so why I brought up the big
or people just live in their
difference in
fantasies.
sizes in those clients is they were going about having sex in the friction sex way, and they're not compatible. I do think your technology of suction sex makes any body and any body part compatible because we learn how to move and breathe very differently. But in the friction sex world, there are incompatibilities, and absolutely. And if we're just going for extreme friction type sensation, then of course bigger is better and tighter is better.
Well, and it kind of ends up lending to just the incompatibility is actually the fantasy, and the fantasy is the incompatibility. And so you're going to have a conflict between appreciating what's actually in front of you and the fantasy that you've been garnering this entire time.
And I remember you very recently were saying that you talked to a guy, and he was younger, and he was like, why should I care about her pleasure? Like, I'm never going to see her again. I just want to stick it in, have my fun, and go. Yeah. That like gutted me, because I'm like, wow, you are depriving yourself of something extraordinary. It's like going, I don't know, to a place that has absolute gourmet food, and you just decide to have could you just put this in the deep fryer for me and I'll just eat that. And you're not tasting all the different flavors and textures and nuances. You just want your like little deep fried thing.
Yes.
And it's just like, what? Like, why wouldn't you? This is crazy. Like, it's all available to you. So in the explicit section, I would love to just, make sure we cover what suction sex actually can do and the healing that can happen and the confidence, because even just the guys learning suction sex in their masturbation, like what we've seen with your YAFAP program, has been extraordinary. What we've seen with women doing their like self-pleasuring in that program has been extraordinary, because in both sides, the ability to feel and the confidence that has emerged in people of all ages who are actually with intention practicing your suction sex methodologies, it's amazing. So I'd love to make sure we cover that in the explicit side.
Well, before we jump to that, I just want to also say that there's kind of two ways that people end up going when their fantasies are around the ideals of friction sex. Is that either, like you said, just like, forget the other person, I just get my rocks off, I do my own thing. Mm-hmm. Or, I had another client that was saying that they wanted to have sex for 11 hours, be able to have an erection on verbal command, and never go down. And it was just like, I don't think the partner or the other person actually would want that, So
it's the fantasy, but
you then have these two extreme of fantasies. And I think for women, there was a study that was recently done in McGill, I think it was in the 2000s, and they were looking at students, particularly men and women, and looking at the effects of watching porn. And one of the things that they found interesting was that, especially for the women, that there was, with the guys, they were noticing that there was some body image issues that were coming up, that they didn't look like the male porn stars. But then for the women, there were some issues coming up where they started to have unrealistic expectations on how long sex should last, the physicality of it, and also the size of a penis. And so again, you have these kind of like ideals that start to grow and build based off of, one, the portrayals that we see in culture, but two, then, I don't know, it actually surprises me, it kind of mesmerizes me that we have the obsession with the very thing that actually causes the dysfunction.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's jump into explicit and get into the nitty-gritty, juicy details.
To join us for the complete and explicit version of the podcast, simply upgrade your membership and gain instant access.